Yes. Okay. Well, she said to sort of guesstimate, so let's guesstimate and assume that people are watching. Welcome to this edition of Engineering for Good Folks. My name is Dr. Darryl Williams, Senior Vice President, Science and Education here at the Franklin Institute, and it's exciting to welcome you back to this program. We have a really phenomenal guest that I'm sure that you will enjoy interacting with, and so we'll get to him in just a second. But I just want to quickly go over a couple of housekeeping rules. Of course, this is meant to be fun and conversational. So at any point in time, feel free to join us on Facebook chat, send in your questions, and we'll do our best to get to your questions throughout this program. So yeah, let's dive in. So as I said, I have a really exciting guest today. He really, his work really sits at the intersection of art, science, engineering, and design. And so we're gonna sort of get a behind the scenes look at the phenomenal work of one of the world's most prolific photographers of the natural world. So how is it possible for him to be able to capture nature in such intimate ways? And what role does engineering and design play in the process? And so we're going to get to some of these questions and more, and our guests will help us unpack some of these as we move through the program. So it is my pleasure to take this opportunity to introduce Anand Varma. He's a freelance photographer, videographer, who uses the camera to tell captivating stories about the natural world. His work sits at the intersection of art, science, engineering, and design. His career started while studying biology at the University of California, Berkeley. He has since become a regular contributor to National Geographic and received numerous awards for his work. He is also the mind behind the Franklin Institute's latest pop-up exhibit, Now Next, Jellyfish Reveal. So welcome, Anand.
Thanks so much, Darryl.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking the time. And I know you're a super busy man and in high demand. And so we're just thrilled not only to have you here on the program today, but also for the partnership to get the new Now Next exhibit up and running and for guests to be able to enjoy. So I just kind of want to start off with a very, very sort of overarching question, right? So you have this phenomenal career, you're trained as a biologist, and you're a photographer, you're a videographer. So can you just sort of share, the first experience picking up the camera to take pictures of nature? What was that aha moment that made you say, you know what, I really want to make this a career?
Sure. No, I mean, if I think back, I mean, in reality, it was a process that unfolded over many years, but there is a moment that I look back on as a key sort of pivotal origin moment. And this is the senior year of high school. I'm 18, I'm growing up in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm hiking around Stone Mountain, which is this park outside the city, which is known for its, big mountain and park. But like me and my buddies would go on the backside and crawl around the forest looking for bugs and animals. And I was with my best buddy, Gene. And at this point, photography is not a major part of my life. It was an important part of my dad's life when he was younger, and he had just started kind of buying a new digital camera, and I saw it lying on the table one day, and I just kind of asked to borrow it, and it was kind of a whim. It was not this planned out, like this is going to be my career, this is an important part of my life. I just thought, well, that's a fun gadget, I'm going to just see what I can do with it. And more important to me for this moment was being in the woods. I grew up, with woods and a stream in my backyard. This is what I loved doing. And we were exploring a new patch of woods, and I came around a bend, and I saw this garter snake, small, a couple feet long, not venomous or anything. It was in a little patch of sunlight in these leaves. And I thought, oh, I have this camera. Let me see if I can sneak up on this snake and take a cool picture. And back in the day, these little point and shoot cameras, like you had to be this close from your subject to get a macro photo. So I slowly snuck up on the snake, and I got real close to its face. And for whatever reason, it didn't get scared. And I took this picture. And the picture is one that, was one of the early pictures I'm proud of. But it wasn't really the picture that stuck with me. It was the reaction of my friend Gene standing next to me who was like losing his mind because I'd gotten this close and I'd gotten a picture and there was so much detail in this picture. And the snake's still there. Like we could have been looking at the real thing, but instead we're looking at the camera and like, oh, this is so cool. Like you can see the scales, you can see the reflections on the side. And that's the part that stuck with me. It's this like feeling that, whoa, a camera is this portal to connecting with other people. It's this way of sharing these moments of discovery. And now I could go home, I could show my parents, I could show our friends who didn't go, like, look at this thing that we saw. And from that moment on, like he wanted a camera, our friends wanted cameras. Like, our adventures in the woods became these treasure hunts. Like, what can we find? What can we capture? What can we share? And that's really, I had no inklings of photography as a career at that moment, but I started getting addicted to this feeling of discovery and of excitement that comes with sharing that discovery.
So I'm curious too, as you were having that experience and then decided to pursue biology, for study, did it change your approach to the sciences? Having made that, were you more curious? Did the questions that you started asking become more? I would imagine because of the work that you do, you see things that other people don't necessarily see. You're a little probably more detail oriented. Did you start to see some of those attributes start to emerge, or maybe that's something that you're thinking about now as I ask you the question?
I think it has, but only in the later stages. At the beginning, it was exactly the opposite. It was my interest in science and my curiosity about science is what drove photography. And it was not that photography, I changed sort of career directions, but it was not that photography replaced science. It became the tool in which I could actually follow up on the questions that I had. And so it was more that science and this idea of experimentation and hypothesis and that sort of scientific method that I brought over to the photography world. And it's only now that I'm starting to kind of circle back into the science world and bringing all the tools I developed in the photography world back into saying, like, how do we pay attention? How do we collect data in a visual way? How do we explore something we don't know the answer to through this sort of visual experimental process? And so it sort of like started with science, went through this whole photography realm. It sort of picked up some new ideas about how to look and how to pay attention and how to display information. And now kind of circling back into science and in some ways sort of picking up new science. It's sort of just it's sort of been a hybrid intersection this whole time. It's not really that I'm like abandoning photography to become a scientist, or that I abandoned science to become a photographer, but
it sounds like they reinforce each other, right?
No,
it sounds like there's all these built-in reinforcements through the science, the photography, and they work together. It's very well integrated. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'm curious too, like, so you've taken a lot of photographs and you filmed a lot of videos to date. What's the most complicated image you've ever tried to capture?
That's hard to say. It feels like each project becomes complicated in a new way. But I would say maybe with hummingbirds, there was an image I took of a hummingbird licking a little puddle of artificial nectar out of a glass dish. And there was a couple of components that made that really complicated. One was just the sort of technical lighting parts of like, how do you light this glass dish and a hummingbird and freeze its wings? And there's a kind of a bunch of tricks to figure that out. But then layered on top of those sort of technical problems was this behavioral problem of like, how do you train a hummingbird to only approach this glass dish from one specific side and stick its beak through like a 2 millimeter little hole in this glass dish when it could actually approach from any other direction. And as soon as it learns that it can get this nectar without having to stuff its face through this hole, it's like, well, why would I do that? And you have to start all over with a new bird. It takes 3 days to kind of get it acclimated. And so it's like layering the biology problems with the lighting problems with the camera problems. And so that's often where my projects are. It's not just a physics problem. There's like an animal behavior issue. Like, how do you get this animal to like put its head in this hole, or show you its babies, or like fly through this little obstacle course.
Yeah. So the sequencing of things and the timing of things. And so my follow-up question to that is: there's something that, or you were in process and it just went completely wrong, and you just weren't able to, what was that experience like, where you went in with one objective and it just completely either completely just detoured and you had to be spontaneous and reactive, or you're just like, this just isn't going to work?
Oh, I mean, every single picture starts that way. Maybe there's one in 50 or one in 100 that you're like, oh, plan A totally worked. And we're done early. And done early means like I figured it out in 3 days instead of 2 weeks or 30 days. But the rest of the time, that's where you're starting from. You're like, uh-oh, this whole scheme I had, not going to work. I'm going to have to adapt and react. And if you stick with it long enough, almost always I can find an amazing, surprising way to show something that was not even what I imagined to be. It's like, it was better than what I imagined to start with, which is great. There's one example that sticks out in my mind where I never got there, which is on this story about giant carnivorous bats in Mexico. You have these bats that have a 3-foot wingspan. They're hunting rats and birds and other bats, and they only happen to live in hollow trees. And in this part of Mexico, we only know of one tree, and the scientists has figured out how to find them. And we know the tree that they live in, and there's 3 bats. And I'm like trying to set up a camera rig that photographs it leaving this or entering this like hollow tree cavity. And so you're 30 feet in the air, hanging off a harness. You're having to install this camera and these infrared sensors that will trigger the flashes. And first thing that goes wrong is this tree happens to be poisonous, which I didn't know that. So it's oozing this black ooze that has the same stuff as poison ivy, but like way more concentrated. And I'm super allergic to poison ivy. So you're like wrestling this tree and screwing bolts into it. And I still have like this little dark mark on my arm is from 6 years ago.
So were you like dodging tree ooze while you were like trying to?
No, I didn't know. I didn't know until 3 days later. All of a sudden, like my body is like bursting in these blisters. And I went to the emergency room and they're like pumping me full of antihistamines or whatever. And so, but then like my camera's there. That's the only place that these bats live. And so now I'm like, I have this like horrible allergic reaction, and I still have to climb this tree at least once a day to change out the cards and to fiddle with this thing. And so I'm like head to toe in a Tyvek suit, like fiddling with this thing, trying to get the cards down. And then we were trying to let it run for 6 months at a time. So that Tom O'Brien, the engineer at National Geographic, rigged up this whole system with solar panels and a car battery and these regulators that would basically power the camera continuously for 6 months. Come back 6 months later, and it's just like 100 pictures of my hand as I'm setting up the camera, and then a bunch of blank pictures of like a leaf that triggered the sensor. There's no bats. It never worked. It was all for nothing. And I just have the scar to remember.
The scar to remind you of the experience. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. So you were kind of giving us a little bit of an understanding of what you go through in some cases to capture some of these phenomenal pictures. Can you take some time to walk us through like the process? And then also too, as I mentioned ahead of the program, there's this beautiful intersection of art, science, engineering, and design in your work. So the science we've talked about a little bit, the art to some extent, thinking about it from the photographic perspective, but then the engineering and design, like how do you come up with some of these contraptions to get to be able to capture some of these amazing pictures?
Sure. No, I mean, it's a like one baby step at a time. I mean, it's not really the picture and the device to capture the picture are not invented out of in one step and that just come to me in some epiphany. It's sort of even the picture itself. Sometimes I have an idea of it ahead of time. Oftentimes that idea I have to throw out immediately. And so I'm working basically in this sort of foggy unknown where all I know is that this animal does something really cool, and I'm just trying to figure out the right angle to translate this like crazy process or behavior into something that's sensible to other people. It's not enough to just capture something. It has to be captured in a way that's clear and interesting and is a blend of surprising but also relatable and familiar. And so it's a very iterative process in which I'm just doing little mini experiments and trying to learn from each step. And I think this came out of I've never owned a film camera. Like my first camera was a digital camera, which meant you could look at your result immediately. And that trained me to do a completely different approach than what film photography would have required, developing an intuition of how an image would translate onto film. I developed a process of analysis and experimentation. And so, okay, let's say I want to, the project I'm working on now that I worked on with Franklin is on jellyfish. And for example, I know the early life stage of a jellyfish looks like a tiny anemone. It's super small. And all I want to do is show what this looks like and how small it is. That's the overall goal. And so as soon as, in this case, it's not still images, but with video, I'm like, okay, well, how do I zoom from far away up to close? So like show a shell that it's on that we know what the size is, and then zoom up close to it. It's a fairly simple goal, but it turns out they don't make lenses that do that. They don't make cameras that can do that automatically. And so that was that was a problem I had been thinking about for a couple of years. And it took me at least a year of focused effort to solve that. Because as soon as I built a contraption that could move the camera and change the focus in this very specific relationship, the camera would shake because it's a high magnification. So just trying to figure out how to get the vibration to minimize the vibration. That was like 6 months of learning how to control a stepper motor, how to minimize the vibration of that stepper motor, how to add little dampeners to it, how to adjust if the motor is not aligned well. And I got a lot of help from, I'm staying with my brother who's more engineering inclined than I am, and he was able to connect me to other people who are able to say like, okay, well, here's how you can think about solving this problem of like you have a motor that's spinning and it's shaking. Like, well, how do you get that motor to do its job without translating all of that vibration? And so along the way, like I bought a 3D printer and I learned how to use that. And so we're like building all of these custom components just to move this camera this far and turn the lens this much without shaking.
I think and what I want to convey to the audience, which I think is important, right, is like in order to capture some of these images, the level of sensitivity that you have to be mindful of is really important, right? So just the slightest vibration can throw off what you're intending to capture. So you have to pay attention to these nuances every single time, right? Which is really, and I never thought about it. So it's interesting that you have to be so mindful of these things.
And there's two different things I'm trying to balance. There's sort of like, okay, I know I want to show this baby jellyfish in a certain way, and I'm chasing that vision, and I have to balance that kind of commitment and patience and kind of obsession with that idea with an openness to pivot if a better idea comes along. Because you can get stuck in one idea and saying, I'm not going to give up until I solve this. And meanwhile, you know, there's like discoveries happening right in front of you that nobody's ever seen before that you're like, no, that's in the way. I'm trying to just get this one shot. And at the same time, if you don't have that map that orients you to what you're trying to finish, it's very easy to just say, oh, that's too hard. Let's try something else. Oh, there's 10 different things we could do, and you never get anything done. And you're just chasing whatever the latest little distraction is. And that's been something I have certainly not mastered, but recognized that having a plan from the get-go and also being open to recognizing that like your plan may not be the best idea, and that adapting to the new opportunities in front of you. I mean, that I apply to a specific image, but that's kind of the lesson I've learned through my career, that I wanted to be a marine biologist, and I was set on that for 10 years. And it took me a long time to pry myself out of that and saying like, actually photography is a better way to do that. And it doesn't represent a huge failure you are not a failure for not fulfilling your dream, your 10-year-old dream of being a marine biologist. But in fact, you're more in touch with what you really care about and what you're trying to accomplish. And you can do that in this other better path. You can apply it, like that happens in an engineering decision too, where you're like, oh, I thought I needed to use this adhesive and I needed to use this motor, but actually I could save a boatload of time if I just do this other silly thing that isn't as satisfying as an approach, but does the job so much better.
And how much of that too really involves ideas and perspectives that come from collaborating, right? So it's, you know, we can be very narrow-minded and focused if we're only sort of operating from the lens and perspective of our own, but when we bring in and invite other people to be part of the process, then that opens the window for more opportunities and ways of seeing things differently, right?
Oh,
I would and I know that you have some video that you wanted to share too to kind of help illustrate some of your contraptions.
And I can show you specifically about that one contraption of moving the camera while changing the focus. Like, let me pull that up here.
Sure.
All right. Darryl, can you see this video playing?
I can. Yep.
All right. So what you're seeing is a motor moving this video camera while changing focus. And on top of all that, we actually figured out how to poke a lens through the front of a piece of glass without the water all scooping everywhere. And smoothly enough that I can, oh, well, it doesn't actually show the final footage, but let me just play that again.
Sure.
And so this is all something I built in my garage in Berkeley.
And how long did it take you to build this?
I mean, the first version, maybe a few weeks, but then overall, I basically kept on iterating on it over the course of about a year and a half. And so this is the red camera that I'm using here. It goes into this little plastic port where my friend Nick Parker came up with this design of we used a really thin plastic bag that actually created the seal of the water that let us push, essentially a gasket with zero friction that let me push the lens in and out without having to, if you were to basically use these really strong rubber gaskets, there would be a ton of friction and that would cause a lot of vibration. And this was basically a frictionless system that let me zoom in while maintaining focus using a wide angle lens that makes you feel like you're in the world of these jellyfish. And that was to get one shot out of, you know, maybe 80 different shots that the ultimate video had to have in the end.
And so these monitors up here they're just part of helping you kind of guide.
Yes, the one on the left tells me what's in focus. The one in the middle is actually what controls the camera. It's hard to see in this particular image. The big one in the background is actually suspended on an arm that's designed for a hospital bed. So it sort of projects out of the wall, and I can basically, it's articulated, so I can swing it around anywhere in the room. That suspends from the ceiling on a bunch of springs, and that lets me kind of see up close and check that all the framing is right. Um, and I can show, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
While you're, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say the next thing I can show you is actually how I was able to. This is how I made the films, but I actually had to figure out how to keep the jellyfish alive in the first place.
Yes,
And that was
that's
shown like
important.
full year of experimenting with custom tank designs. And I could show that. I could show that video next, whenever.
Sure. Well, and the question I was about to ask you is, to what extent has your tinkering and the engineering and the things that you've come up with to be able to capture these images influenced the field from the perspective of photography, video capture in science? Because I would imagine you've come up with some pretty unique ways of being able to do this work that others may have not either tried or weren't successful at. So I'm just curious if you've had made any sort of impact in that way.
Yeah, I think so. I actually just got off my last call 20 minutes ago, training a series of early career storytellers on photography techniques. So that's something I do a lot of. And actually, National Geographic has had an engineering department for I don't know how many decades that has supported photographers. And I've actually designed some tools, especially around fiber optics, that they've essentially copied and have shared with their photographers to be able to use. So in that case, that's like how you focus a beam of light onto a very tiny subject. And I came up with some new ways of like lighting up an ant's eyeball without lighting up the rest of its head, that I think has been beneficial to other photographers. Now, this jellyfish project itself, this is, Franklin is the first time it's really being shared with the public. And so I won't yet know what impact that has yet, because these kinds of videos, very few people have seen the behind the scenes, and I haven't had a chance to really share that story and those techniques. But so much of what I've learned about lighting and photography has come from sort of open access online, blogs and things like that. So I feel a kind of a sense of duty and a sense of satisfaction in being able to turn around and say, like, share, here's how I figured this out, and take it and make it better. And I'm going to go solve a new problem in this corner over here.
So I have a couple of questions that have come through of the audience, and actually one of the questions is one that I was going to ask as well. Is there something that you haven't captured yet in nature but would love to?
Yeah, and I kind of started, like, that's the main motivation for spending the last 4 years of my life with jellyfish, was just to observe, to witness this radical transformation from the baby to an adult. Like, the way they change their bodies is so surprising and ridiculous. That's kind of was the motivation, and that interest actually came from this accidental video I did on honeybees that showed this transformation, and that's really inspired me to try to track down these stories of metamorphosis, and of how our bodies take shape, how the bodies of different animals take shape, and what that teaches us about our own bodies. And that's kind of what I wanted. I could easily spend the next 10 years of my life, spying on a chicken embryo inside an egg and showing how it becomes a bird, or a frog egg and how it becomes an embryo. And I think that has incredible visual potential as like a beautiful image. And I think that beauty is this pathway into curiosity about the scientific process. And that's something that I both just want to know for myself, but I also have the sense that if I can capture that, I might actually be able to also contribute a new way of understanding these crazy things that happen kind of in front of our eyes, are all around us, and yet we don't really appreciate how profound these processes are. So just spying on the development of these different animals. That's kind of what I want to do next.
That's really cool. I also think that's really cool about your work is it's a really great example of showing, again, I keep saying these intersections, but you really show how science informs engineering and how engineering then circles back and informs science. Your work is a beautiful example of the partnership that science and engineering have together. And so I just, for those folks who are out there watching, and particularly for students who are watching, I hope that you're sort of gleaning some of these insights from Anand's work, because it's just a really, really, really great sort of real life example of how these two processes work together. Another question has come through the audience. For budding photographers, what's the best way to learn more? Can you recommend any classes or resources?
It depends on where, it helps to decide what you're most interested in tackling. It doesn't mean that you have to commit to that for the rest of your life, but if you can sort of narrow and bite off one smaller chunk at first, then it's easier to kind of make a bit of progress, because it's otherwise it's very easy to just get completely overwhelmed by just Googling like photography course, and you're going to get so many different versions of the same thing. For me, there's a blog called strobist.com that was so instrumental in me understanding the basic ways of manipulating light, especially artificial light. So if you're someone who's interested or willing to kind of go down this artificial lighting path, that was a really helpful. There's all these kind of 101 tutorials. It's all free. There's a lot of case studies and examples. It's super accessible. It's not like how to take a picture, but it's once you're comfortable with a camera and you're interested in artificial lighting, that's kind of where I got my foundation. If you're interested in microscope photography or like really high magnification photography, there's a forum called photomacrography.net. And as with any forum, it's a little bit challenging to find exactly what you want, but that's a resource where I still go, and I learned so much from this group of essentially hobbyists who've invented all kinds of ways of adapting microscope lenses to cameras, and like the beautiful ways that the results they get from that. So if you want to go beyond what kind of macro photography equipment that you can just buy straight off the shelf, that's a great resource just to learn so much about what lenses and how to build little platforms, and I have not come close to exhausting the resources there. Otherwise, it comes down to looking at a lot of pictures and taking a lot of pictures and spending the time to trying to reflect on those pictures. I mean, you could take millions of pictures, but if you don't stop to try to think about how did picture one and picture two differ, and try to do that sort of analytical work of like, and you can do this with any two pictures, right? If you're stuck on and this is what I do. This is what I do when I'm like, I've committed to taking pictures of hummingbirds. Like, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know where to start. All you have to do is hit the shutter button twice and change something, like the angle of the light or something. And all of a sudden you have two reference points to say, okay, well, these are both terrible pictures, but this one, if I had to pick one, I would go with this one. And that's because it's a little bit closer, or there's a little bit more color. And as soon as you have those two, then you can dump those and you take a new frame and you say, well, I wouldn't show anybody these, but I would like, at least I'm going in the right direction, and you can sort of dig your way out of a hole. And so if you're starting from scratch, it's just like, okay, well, what do you go outside, you have a phone. What are you drawn to? Is it people? Is it your neighbors? Is it a stranger on the street? Okay, well, that tells you something about what interests you, and you can lean into that direction. Is it animals? Is it bugs? Is it small stuff? Then it tells you something about, okay, well, maybe I should learn more about macro photography. And again, you don't have to commit to one of these, but learning more, it's kind of more about like looking inside yourself and trying to sort out what are you trying to get out of this, and that can help clarify where you should put your time.
And some of the skills that are interesting that I feel that are developed in this process is evaluation and critique, right? Which are all part of science and they're part of engineering. So again, for students who are watching this program, these, as you said, we all have well, most of us have camera phones. Really easy to use that as and develop, or use it as an opportunity to start to practice some of these things. I know as you were describing that, I was thinking about for myself, I enjoy the feature on my phone and taking pictures. I prefer probably more landscape and architecture pictures than I do taking pictures of people per se. But again, it's that looking at, picture one, picture two, and saying, oh, well, how could I change the angle here, or the lighting is really good here, so how can I position it for, so that process of really that analytical process of evaluation and critique, I think is a really an important skill that I think gets developed over time and with photography.
Yeah. 100%.
So I think you said you have another video too that you wanted to share.
Let me pull that up. So actually, I found the version that actually has the ending here. So I'm going to skip over that, but here's what this video actually looks like when you're able to smooth everything out and send the lens through the front of the tank. And the purpose of this is these are mussel shells. So these are things that are a couple of inches long, and they get covered in what might actually look like coral or anemones, and this is actually what a baby jellyfish looks like.
Yeah, I was going to say it looks like what I saw downstairs.
Yeah.
So they attach themselves to the shells, and that's sort of where they start the initial development process?
That's where they start their first process. So I can pull out of this, and I'll show you kind of the little aquariums that I set up in my backyard. So initially, this was going to be a project where I flew all over the world and I visit these labs. And actually, the year before COVID, I started realizing I'm wasting a lot of time hanging out in the machine shop of this aquarium and not actually filming. I could be doing this at home. And pretty quickly, I kind of realized, actually, I could do this whole project at home. I grew up working at a pet store. I had 8 aquariums. Some of that equipment I had in high school, my mom still had in the basement. And so I called her up, and she shipped out the light you see here and the pumps and filters and everything. It was from when I was in middle school and high school. And so then COVID hit, and all of a sudden it's all my jellyfish are at home with me. So it became a different kind of I could focus all of my effort on these kinds of technical engineering problems rather than how do I get my bag on the airplane and my camera's not broken. Like that.
Right. So now, what inspired you to take your work and create an experience inside of a museum that guests could enjoy?
Sure. I've done several magazine stories, which I love working for National Geographic magazine. You get put your work in front of tens of millions of people. I did a TV show with National Geographic as well. Instagram, you can reach 100 million people. But the thing that really stuck with me throughout that process, I was also giving these lectures in lecture halls across the country. And I would see how people would react to these same images in a totally different way when they had time to sit with them and to experience them, not exactly in person, you're not in the ocean with this jellyfish, but you're in this dark space and you're giving your attention to the story. And I thought, okay, I want to play with this some. I want to think about how can images foster new kinds of relationships between people and nature. I mean, for me, images became this way of continuing the childhood curiosity with the natural world. How can I share that? How can I replicate this experience I had with my buddy Gene and this picture of a garter snake, showing him the back of the camera. How do I get at that? And how do I build on that? And how do I experiment with that? And so this exhibit with the Franklin was exactly that this door that opened in front of me, I was like, oh, this is a really cool opportunity to play with images, play with video, and see, can I use these videos to get people to think about jellyfish and see jellyfish in a new way?
Mhm.
It's a totally different medium than if this was an Instagram story or a YouTube video that you're watching on your phone, which it will be someday. But I think the opportunity to harness people's attention and to get them to think about this animal and maybe other animals, maybe their surroundings a little bit differently, is so much more so much more potential when you have an immersive space with music and to play with kind of real jellyfish but video that shows you what you wouldn't have noticed, and try to kind of show like, hey, there's how do I peel back layers of detail and complexity and try to convince people to pay closer attention. And it seemed like an in-person physical immersive space was a way more interesting way to do that than a video you watch on a tiny screen on your phone.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, I can say for myself, and I imagine others who have experienced it, it's just, it's, as I said, it's beautiful. It's, there's definitely a lot of wow moments. It does bring jellyfish, right there and provide an opportunity for further exploration. So I think you did a fantastic job, and can't wait to see what else you come up with and decide to share with people.
Well, thanks so much. It's been an awesome journey. It's been so cool to work with the Franklin, and I learned so much. I mean, this is not a thing I've ever done before, and so it was so cool to learn and to also be in the space and just to watch how people interact and think about, okay, well, how would I do this differently? What worked, what didn't? It's been an amazing journey, and yeah, I hope to be doing more work like it in the future.
Absolutely. Well, Ben and I have enjoyed our time with you today. Again, we know you're a busy guy, so we appreciate that you're able to squeeze us into your schedule. I want to encourage guests and those watching to please come to the Franklin Institute and check out our Now Next Jellyfish Revealed exhibition. Again, the brains behind it here, Anand Varma and his phenomenal work, photography and videography. I think we're going to wrap up. Thanks for tuning in. And I'll see you next time here on Engineering for Good. Take care.